Well, thank you very much, George, for that very kind introduction, and thank you, BioIT, for inviting me, and thank you, everybody, for being here this morning. So we'll jump right in on this. So I do have a conflict of interest. I am founder and CEO of Envision Genomics, so you can decide whether or not this talk is relevant to that or not. It's related, but. So the market today, the market is segmented into reference laboratories for genes, gene panels, exomes, which is about 1.5% of the genome, whole genome, sequencing technology companies, bioinformatic companies, data storage companies, IT companies. But how do you glue all of this together? So things that people are worrying about is startup costs. It's really expensive. The technology is going to change. Analytics, bioinformatics, data storage, the need for lots of samples in order to make a molecular diagnosis. Technology is expensive and is changing, and it's the cost per test and reimbursement. So if you wonder why we're not using this more clinically, it's all on this page, okay? But perhaps what we don't think about often enough is the rate-limiting step, and you're all bio-IT folks, is how do we get a terabyte of data to the fingertips of a physician that in the United States has 7.5 minutes of contact time with a patient? If we can't do that, we don't need to do the rest of this, because that's the rate-limiting step. And how do the patients use that? So I'm going to focus my time on thinking about that. Here's the other part I want you to think about is the researchers. Our research is publishing conflicting data. And I will show you from insurance companies what that means and how they're using that information to limit the utility on that. Gene tests are more accurate rather than whole genome sequencing. Gene panels are cheaper rather than whole genome sequencing. Exomes have all the data and are more accurate. There's too much data. The ethics of the secondary results. Whole genome sequencing is not as accurate. Conclusion, whole genome sequencing is not a validated clinical test. We shouldn't be using it. So these are all the things I face every single day when we're trying to help patients and figure out what's wrong with them. So when you're publishing this stuff, I'm not saying we don't publish, but think about what you say and why you say it. And if you're publishing on genes as a basic researcher, that information is also being used clinically. We've blurred the lines between research and clinic. And that's only going to get more complicated as we go down the road. So the overview is rare disease is a huge problem. That might surprise many of you. I'm going to argue that whole genomes are better than panels and exomes. I'll go through that in great detail. What is utility? I will tell you that inside medical practice, clinical utility means something different inside subspecialties. It's very hard to get somebody to really define utility in the same way. What data do you return? A major issue. And what are we doing to expand access? What about the economics and insurance? I'll talk about that. And how do you get the results, as I said, to the physician? So Hudson Alpha, this is a little picture of our building. So it's a biotech development institute, so we have 16 faculty. We're focused on genomics. We're the 4th largest genome sequencing group in the country. And we were the first to do CAP-CLIA certified sequencing for the HiSeq X10s under Sean Levy. And so we also have the largest double helix. There's actually a run going on right there last night. So if you want to come see Hudson Alpha, you can see the largest helix in the United States. So a little bit about Huntsville, because I didn't know much about Huntsville till I moved there. So I kind of like the fact that Bloomberg News published this in September. So unlikely cities that will power the US economy. We have a big STEM program in Huntsville. Why? Because the US rocket industry. If you've heard of Marshall Flight Center, that's in Huntsville, Alabama. And the US rocket industry is still all there. So we have a high-tech city that we're involved with. That's one of the reasons why we moved there, in addition to the biotech. So rare disease is a huge problem. How big of a problem? It sounds kind of silly, right? Rare disease sounds rare. So by medical definition, rare disease means less than 200,000 cases. That's what rare means. But the numbers of rare disease is gigantic. So this is some statistics around this. So it's viewed as about 5% to 10% of the US population has a rare undiagnosed disease. That's pretty hard to imagine in 2016 that there's this many things that are going on. And I'll give you a simple example, cancer. When we say cancer, we think cancer. Right? When we say breast cancer, we think breast cancer. But we all know there's subcategories of disease. Imagine if each of those had its own name. We wouldn't think of cancer as being common at all. So that is, in fact, the problem with rare disease. It sounds rare, but it's not. So the other problem with this is that is a huge problem for these families and patients. So it takes, on average, if a diagnosis is made at all, 7+ years. An average of 3 misdiagnoses and over 8 different visits. And these families go from place to place to place. So our interest at Hudson Alpha is how do we help these families get a diagnosis faster? Imagine going from doctor to doctor being told, I don't know what's wrong with your child. So there's also a huge impact of diagnostic error in this country. You may not know this. So the Institute of Medicine just published this last summer. 1 in 20, 5% of all diagnoses made are errors. That means the average physician makes 62 misdiagnoses per year. It's a gigantic number. And I'm not picking on the physicians. I'll get to that in a moment. Why? Because there's thousands of potential diagnoses. But there's only about 250 reasons why people come in and complaining about something. So how do you reconcile that? 10% of deaths and between 6 and 17% of hospital admissions are due to misdiagnoses. Obviously, with that many number of deaths, there's a big malpractice portion about that. But the biggest challenge in this report is clinicians aren't sure what test to order. So let's just imagine now what we're doing with gene panels and individual gene tests. Which test do you do? Why do I do that? I'm just going to argue one simple test is a lot easier to figure out than doing each individual test. And you can see if you like that or not by the end of this. So how do we change this? So I'm just going to say the only thing in this room that doesn't have a blueprint, this stupid tie has a blueprint, okay? You don't have a blueprint. We ask our physicians to practice medicine without a blueprint. And worse than that, we practice medicine on average. So these two individuals, they're phenotypically distinct from each other. They're both adults, and they both have a headache. And they go to the medicine cabinet, and it says adults take 2 aspirin. How many of you think? And everybody laughs. Why do you laugh? Why? Because it's silly, right? Shaq should take 4. And I can't find Danica's weight, but I'm guessing she's going to take 1. Okay? But on average, they're both adults. Take 2. That's how we practice medicine. On average, that medicine's safe. On average, you should do this. But the reason you could laugh is because you could see the difference between them. If the physician couldn't see the difference, how would they know? So your DNA, in fact, gives you that information. So these two individuals, as you know, are only different between 4 and 6 million base pairs. And one single change is enough to cause a disease, whether it's cancer or rare undiagnosed disease. And if you glue together all the DNA and all the cells end to end, it's 666.5 round trips to the sun and back. You are all a big data problem for your physician. So how do you glue this all together? How do you do something with this? Well, and then there's precision medicine. Right? So these are all the pieces that go around in precision medicine. And my view of precision medicine is this is all the information that you in the bio-IT world have to amalgamate down so a physician can be able to use. So to me, precision medicine is what we give the physician. What you do with the data from your genome, that's personalized medicine. And if you've had your genome sequenced like I have, and you have breast cancer in your family like I have, and you have 2 daughters like I have, that's a very personal conversation. That is not a precision medicine discussion at all. That's, do you want to know if dad's carrying BRCA mutations? And of course he is, right? Because we all carry variation in our genes. We just don't know what they all mean. That's a personal conversation. So there was a time when it cost $1 billion and 10 years to sequence the first human. Genetics was a subspecialty. Now genetics is everywhere. In fact, your family history data is a poor man's genetics. Did you ever think about that? The whole reason you fill out a family history form is genetics. It just happens to be lousy data because we never talk about it, right? When patients weren't consumers. As you know, if you haven't looked for those in the United States, every year the amount you're going to pay out of pocket increases because the only way to bend the healthcare curve is for you to pick how you're going to spend your money. Okay, so that's only going to get worse. You're going to become increasingly a consumer when sequencing was for research use anyway. So I got into this with Nick Volker. You may or may not have heard this story. So this is Nick at 2. This is Nick at 4. After he's been in and out of hospitals for several years, and trial and error medicine is what we were doing on this. And surprisingly, medicine pays for trial and error. Right? We all talk about evidence-based medicine, but when we don't know what's wrong, we pay over and over again for trial and error. So I got involved with Nick was dying. Alan Mayer contacted me and asked if we could sequence his genome. We said, well, we thought so. We did exome sequencing, and we came up with he's got a gut disease. And the solution was to do cord blood transplant for a gut disease. There is no evidence in the literature to say you should do that. But here's Nick 42 days after transplant. And here's Nick at 11 years old, now down opening our clinic. There's been interest around this. The reporters that got involved in this actually won a Pulitzer Prize. And there's been interesting analogs of what people think how we did this and how we didn't do this. If you really care, and I don't know if you want to know this or not, but the publishers just put out a book. I think it comes out next week or this week. Anyway, I have no vested interest in the book other than I'm in there. But otherwise, if you're interested in the story, it tells how we really did this. It was hard for us to get this published. It was an N of 1. We went to 7 journals, and we couldn't get anybody to publish this. Why? Because we were cowboys and irresponsible for using a research-only use tool, right? And to do something that we were just lucky on. That's what the views are around the world. And I'm very happy to say that now there's been an estimate over 200,000 patients have benefited by next-generation sequencing, which sounds great, except for the fact that there's about 20 million Americans that need the sequencing. So we have a gigantic gap between what's possible and where we are. So we asked this question back in 2010. How many NICs are there? How many can we solve? What if we deploy this technology and make this available and move out into the clinic and more common? I will tell you that in this audience, multiple people will come talk to me about a family member that has a rare disease. So I'm going to encourage you, if you are comfortable with that, to share that with your friends and neighbors around this. People have to know how common this is and how desperate people are around this, because without that, we're not going to go anywhere. So share your story with people if you're comfortable with that. So I want to just talk, you know, people tell me over and over again that it's not useful clinically, that it's not going to benefit people. People don't know how to use it. Physicians aren't going to want to use it. But I want to just show you a video. This is from when we were in Milwaukee.
Our whole life, since Lillian's been born, has been kind of like a roller coaster ride. She was born at 30 weeks, 1 pound, 4 ounces, 11 3/4 inches long. She was ill several times in the NICU. She was tested for Shwachman-Diamond syndrome. She's been tested for cystic fibrosis. She slowly stopped eating anything by mouth, and we just did 2 feedings. She's had 3 colonoscopy endoscopies. I can't even remember all of the different things she's been tested for.
They had been to many institutions. They had been seen by many doctors. They'd been seen by geneticists. They'd been seen by all sorts of other subspecialists.
She had been through so many different tests, and with them all coming back negative, I think that at times that they wondered if they ever would find a diagnosis.
She became sick in fall of 2010. I remember looking at her one day and feeling like she was dying in front of me. She had gone from 24 pounds to 18, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong. So that's when we came to Children's.
You know, the whole concept of the whole genome sequencing was new to us.
Genome sequencing is a process where we examine or we look at all of the genetic material, all of the DNA, all of the instructions that a person has.
Its purpose is to help us diagnose children when we've not been able to find a diagnosis before. Many physicians suspected she might have a genetic condition,
She really fit many of the criteria of a patient who had an unexplained disorder and for which there may be potential treatment strategies.
Genomics is almost our fulcrum, if you will, to the reach out to the many, many specialties that our genetics program supports.
One of the remarkable aspects of whole genome sequencing is really the range of patients that we've been able to help. Patients with intestinal problems, patients with immune problems, patients with neurologic problems, patients with cancer. The list goes on and on.
If they could find something that would tell us why Lillian is who she is and why she has the problems that she has, that was our #1 thing.
Anything to give her a better life.
When we finally found the molecular diagnosis for Lillian through her genomic sequencing, we were just ecstatic. I couldn't wait to pick up the phone. I couldn't wait to call them.
She's the first child that's been diagnosed with this in the United States. She's unique, the diagnosis is unique. We have an answer. It gives something for the specialist to continue to look into, to see what they can do to better help us.
Lillian has made tremendous progress over the years. Every time I see her, she's doing better and better.
By doing the whole genome sequencing, we don't have to keep searching. If it weren't for Children's Hospital, we're not sure if Lillian would still be here with us today.
So several points that I want to make in this. So obviously it's of value to that family. So that's something that's called personal utility. But is there clinical utility in that? Is there clinical utility in the family stopping going place to place? What about all the testing that's gone on? You know what? You can go from hospital to hospital and they'll pay for the same test to be done over and over again, but they won't pay for a whole genome sequencing, right? So how much money was spent in the context of this case versus what it took to solve this? So we know, these are many of our kids on here, not all of them, the Berry twins are not our kids. We know this helps kids. But we're making a diagnosis only about 30% of the time. We need more genomes to be sequenced. The more genomes that are sequenced, the more power we have. It's simple, right? The more there is, the more we can deal with what those variants are. Because rare disease, it's relatively an easy algorithm. If you have this rare disease and you share a variant with anybody else, it's unlikely to cause it because the extreme phenotypes are so great, right? So every genome that's sequenced has a value proposition for the patient, for the family, and for society, right? That information is just vital. So I moved to Hudson Alpha in August, and one reason was because of Sean Levy. He's got a large sequencing lab. He does sequencing for people around the world, and he had the HiSeq. So being able to now do 15,000 clinical genomes is a big deal for me. So I now have gone from a different problem set. How do we find 15,000 patients, right? Versus how do we stand up a technology? How do we get the IT in place? We do a lot of sequencing for other groups, so Sean does for St. Jude's and other hospital systems, and so if people are interested in that, you can contact Sean. My whole point is the reason I moved was because of this technology being in place and something we could help patients with today. We're also part of the Clinical Sequencing Exploratory Research Group, which is an NIH-funded grant that's just looking at how do we solve these problems. So this is with Rick Myers and Greg Cooper. Greg is one of the developers of CAD, if you've used that software as part of the analysis team. So we've got a pretty talented team. And believe it or not, Hudson Alpha is the whole genome sequencing core lab for the Undiagnosed Disease Network. Baylor College of Medicine is doing Exome. So we're actually in this grant looking at a direct comparison between whole genome and whole exome. We believe, and we're seeing, that we can make a diagnosis about 25% more by having the whole genome. And the more genomes that are sequenced, the more power we'll have. And I'll talk about that as we go into it. But here's the fact. So despite the heart-wrenching story of Lillian and Nick and others, insurance companies don't pay for this. It is a major issue. In our publications that we quibble about in research about accuracy, about utility, and so forth, I'm going to show you that that gets then put into policy. And that gets put into why it's not being paid for. So this is from Blue Cross Blue Shield of Alabama. I don't know how much you know about insurance, but every state has its own insurance. So inside each state, there's different markets. Okay? And inside that, there's different rules. And the rules then is what determines what gets paid for. So this is some information. So whole genome sequencing and whole exome does not meet Blue Cross Blue Shield of Alabama's medical criteria and is considered investigative for all indications. So this started in 2013 and it was updated in 2015. So it goes down and it says, well, it's very interesting. It has little specific analytical validity to whole exome sequencing. Well, and they go through some comparisons and talking about that. But these factors contribute to potential variability. So when we argue about variation, well, guess what? That means it's not valid. If we're not accurate, right, sensitivity and specificity, why would we ever pay for this? It's not a valid test. And we go on and said, well, just be clear now, insurance companies aren't the ones who determine care, right? They just determine what gets paid for, right? And it's actually worse than that, because we all pick on the insurance companies. Raise your hand if your employer pays for genomic testing. Yeah, we're all in this business. Our employers don't pay for this. We don't pay for this. You want this? We got to pay for this, right? Whole genome sequencing. You go and you take a look at this. So I'm sure the guys at Stanford would be shocked to know that their paper is being used as evidence for why we shouldn't be doing whole genome sequencing clinically. We're talking about trying to get this down the door. And once this gets there, it's really, really hard to change. The developing evidence about the use of whole exome and whole genome sequencing in clinical practice, studies describing yields of molecular diagnosis in approximately 25% without diagnosis. No studies identified directly comparing these technologies with alternative testing strategies. You know why? Because we didn't work on any of the rest of them, right? So how do you compare something that doesn't exist, okay? So the evidence is insufficient to determine the effects of technology and health outcomes. This is out of a policy, gang. This is not something that I'm making up. This is out of Blue Cross and Blue Shield. Now, there is some advances that are being made, okay? So Cigna says they're going to cover whole exome sequencing, and they put in there. And it says whole genome sequencing isn't going to be covered. You know why? Because it's not clinically validated. Are you kidding me? It's the same technology. We just do a capture, we use the same technology, and one's paid for and one isn't. So what we're doing in our research world and how we're publishing this is having an impact on my care for our kids, okay? So I'm just asking you to think about this. When we're quibbling about some of these things, make sure you put in there somewhere what the context of that is for what we're trying to accomplish. We all want it to be as accurate as possible. Because here's the problem. Here's Nick with 2 years of trial and error. That is paid for. So we have this discontinuous. How do you solve this problem? But here's something that's really important. So we ended up going back and sequencing Nick, his whole genome, because at the beginning we'd only done his exome. That's all we could afford at the time. So this is from his mom, and she's agreed that I can share this back in August. I was already gone, and she's thanking me for the fact that we had sequenced his whole genome, because now Nick ended up having epilepsy. And they were able to go in and look at his genome without any extra cost to solve a problem for his epilepsy. Before this, it was thought just because of all the medications he had taken and all the abuse his body had undergone. But guess what? There's a makeup in his genome that answers the question. Without the whole genome sequencing, they'd still be doing trial and error. So ask your employer to cover whole genome sequencing and next generation sequencing. So exome versus genome, okay? Let's have that debate. How much of the genome to test? ENCODE says 80% of the human genome is functional, biochemically functional. The exome tests 1.5% of the genome. Could the missing heritability be there? Are we only making 30% of a diagnosis because we're not looking at the other percent of the genome that's functional? I'm going to say yes. Gene panels are standard. We're driving these. Why? Because they're reimbursed. But it's a one shot and you're done. It's like an X-ray. You do a gene test and you're done. It adds no value downstream. Whole genome sequencing adds value over time for your diagnosis, your pharmacogenomics, your family history, and traits of personal interest. It's something that's incredibly unusual in medicine. Every single person who has their genome sequenced will get a value proposition out of it, and so will their family, and so will society. I know of no other test that can do that. Well, here's the paper. So this has been widely criticized because people don't want to hear that 80% of the junk DNA actually is functional. Now, what do we know about function on this? Well, the truth is we don't know a lot. There's a lot of information that needs to be done. We need data to be captured around this. People need to think about that. Smart people like in this meeting. Because how do you define functional elements becomes another carrot in this, and stick. What's functional? How do we define function? What's the strength of evidence around this? So each one of these data types has a difference in precision. And that difference in precision, as we publish those differences in precision, are going to impact what we can use clinically and what we can't use clinically. So what's fascinating about this is that there's a lot of data that's highly, highly conserved. Is it junk? Is it not junk? I only know if we don't look, we're never going to know, right? We can't get out of this box by armchairing this. So most of the conserved regions are non-coding. And if you've done some of the evolutionary work, and I know some of the people in this are experts in this, it's incredibly conserved. Is that accidental? We need to look at more and more genomes to answer that question. So, we need more. And just doing more exomes is not going to answer this problem ever. I don't care how many we sequence, whole exome, the entire planet, we're not going to answer this question. So if you don't believe the rest of the genome and you don't believe the ENCODE data, then I'm okay with you staying with it. But we're not going to go very far beyond the 25%. Why? Because we're missing functional elements. I also hear this over and over again. Whole genome sequencing is less accurate than whole exome sequencing. Is that true? When was that study done? What was the depth of coverage? If you do an X10 at 30x, yeah, it's not as good. But clinically, we do it at a 40x. Why? Because it beats exome. And here's a paper that's been published by someone else that was published just last year. And what they did in this case is they sequenced the same DNA exome, 3 different strategies, and whole genome. And they then said, how well will we do on just the exome basis? Because the exome can't cover. So whole genome actually beat exome in this paper, side by side, same DNA, different strategies. Right? Well, it kind of makes sense if you think about it, right? Exome captures another step. There's another loss. There's another error set. Anytime we do another step, there's another problem around that. That's not new. That's not surprising. So is it really less? Well, it's not going to make any difference clinically, right? Because all the information's in the exome, right? I hear that over and over again. Except we published in 2013 that actually that's not the case. So in this first study that we did, we made 9 out of 22. That was our success rate. But we had done whole genome, and we could go back in and then say, what if we had only done exome? We would have missed 3 out of 9 had we only done exome. Okay? So the data's out there, right? It's just a question of do we want to use the data? And we are seeing, as part of the Undiagnosed Disease Network, we are making calls that you wouldn't have been able to make if you had only done exome. So it's not less accurate, and it has clinical utility. What data to return? This is where the data guys have to really get involved in this, because this is where it gets really hairy, right? So the ACMG guidelines, well, that's much easier if you're only going to give the 56 genes back. But is that the right ethical position to take on that? Well, the Presidential Council goes against what ACMG said, right? So, and we actually think there should be a categorical model of choice. We've been doing this since 2010, which means the family and patients get to make up their mind. What data do they want back? So, mandatory disclosures, since these are mostly pediatric cases, and optional. Do you want only mandatory? Do you want non-actionable adult childhood? Do you want actionable adulthood? Or do you want non-actionable? In other words, should you as a parent be allowed to know whether or not your child is at risk for Alzheimer's? Who should make that decision, right? So we actually asked the patients this. And what we found was 58% of the people wanted to know everything. Well, that's just an education problem, right? Those of us in the know, you don't need to know that information, right? So we then went out and we did something really evil. We went out to medical geneticists and genetic counselors and asked them the same question. If it was their child, what would they want to know, right? So it turns out that 31% of those of us that know better want to know everything about our child. So that tells us something fundamental. As a parent, we have a different ownership on this. So who should make that decision? Well, now we do this. We actually do give the patients the choice. So this is our incidental findings. Okay, if you're developing software, that should give you heart palpitations, right? Because now it's different data sets. And you've got to be able to do this rapidly, right? So our analysts have to be able to do this, and the physicians in less than 4 hours with the whole genome. Otherwise, it's not economical. And we can do that. So we have to build that in. How do you solve that? And that's going to change. How do you stay on top of that change? That's bio, that's IT, that's big data set problems we've got to stay on top of as we go through. What about discrimination? Well, GINA is a little bit of a step in the right direction. What do we do with secondary findings? We have to think about how do we define that, because actionable is different. And I'm going to give you some examples here in a moment. The impact of our findings, the right to know. What if I want to know, in my case, about breast cancer, and my daughters don't want to know? What do we do about that? Infrastructure inadequacies. We don't have the infrastructure to be able to provide all of this. And the way you view this is really dependent upon this. So this is my favorite. Okay? So you're either seeing a young woman looking over her shoulder, or you're seeing an old woman pointing down. You're either seeing a rabbit, or you're seeing a duck. Same data, 4 different combinations. Some of you see the old lady and the duck. Some of you see the old lady and the rabbit. It's the same data. But your perspective is what changes. And I will tell you, if you're sick, you have a different perspective on this. If you're a family member and your kid's sick, you view this very differently. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's never going to be a one-size-fits-all. That's a big problem. And your perspective is critical. So when you now take personalized medicine, which is personal decision, and you combine it with precision medicine, wow, right? That's a data nightmare. But that's what we need. And then how do you get that to a physician with 7.5-minute contact time? So summary of data return, it's a personal decision in our view, in our ethicists. It's a balance between paternalism and personal choice. There's cultural differences, huge cultural differences. There's gender differences in all this. Well, of course, you can now back up and say whole genome sequencing is just too expensive, right? So you can fall back on that argument. But is it? So here's better care, lower costs, so ways to implement and share. So this is just some Nick Volker, ending a diagnostic odyssey. He would still have his colon, and the family wouldn't be $7 million in debt. Informed decisions, making wrong choices. So in this case, we had a girl, a little baby, who had liver failure, and she was up for transplant. But she's also showing some neurological decay. So we ended up sequencing her genome and found out she had a novel mutation and a known mutation in a gene called Twinkle, which Twinkle is not a nice gene. It kills you with neurological failure. So do you do the liver transplant or not? So the family decided not to. And the mother said, well, at least I know it's not my fault, and the liver that would have gone to my baby can go to a baby that can have a long life. That is both clinical utility and personal utility around this. What's the cost saving on that? Forget the pain and suffering. I don't even know how to measure that if we had gone through that. But it's at least $500,000 in the healthcare system. Avoid an inappropriate treatment. So here's a family of 3 boys. They were under pressure. The nephrologist was under pressure to put them on exubumab. Exubumab is $600,000 per year per child. It never would have helped the kid. Why? Because the mutation we found, exubumab would have done nothing. So was the physician doing anything wrong? No. That's what he had in his tool chest. They're trying to help out. So how do you measure that across time? Preventative care. Here's a case where we were looking for something else with a kid with muscular dystrophy and ended up finding out that this kid was at risk of dying in his sleep. How do you measure that? That's a good secondary result, right? Here's the one that troubles me. This was one of our kids, Avery, at the Medical College of Wisconsin, where she passed her metabolic test on the day she was born, but started going through a problem set. And it took us 3 years to figure it out. This is before we were doing sequencing. When we went in and looked at her genome, she had a curable metabolic disease. It just had the wrong presentation. Avery will never be normal. She's better now. But what if we had sequenced her genome first? So in these 5 cases, would have saved $9 million, an ROI of 6.5, and that's not counting the other 30% that we made a diagnosis on. Is this really not economical? Here's some medical costs that are up there. Okay? At Hudson Alpha, our clinical cost with Sanger validation is $6,500 for a clinical genome. That's as much as many of the Exome groups are charging. And you can use it over and over again. And other people are starting to report this. The average family, when they go from place to place, it's $19,000 for a workup with a kid with rare undiagnosed disease in that hospital system. Stephen Kingsmore case, it was $7,600 for a whole genome. In our case, it's $65,000. $65,000, $19,000. So I'm going to argue that whole genome sequencing is the only test that can be done once from a wet lab perspective and used for a lifetime. That should make all you bio-IT guys really happy, right? Because it's about data over and over again, right? How do we do that, right? It's really a big difference. It's dynamic. It's going to add value. It's not just an expensive screen. You know why screens are so expensive? Prostate scans? Because you find so few. Every single genome has data in it that is of use. It's all about care. It's really, for me, all about care. There's 20 million Americans that need whole genome sequencing. So these are all the hospitals in the United States. There's about 6 that are doing this. The entire world's capacity for whole genome sequencing is about 1.2 million. We simply have to do better. At some level, we have to quit arguing about this and do it. So who's going to help? How do you get this out there? How do you help more hospitals do this? That's all of our jobs to figure that out. So in Alabama, we've got 3 clinics now that are developed around whole genome sequencing. One in Huntsville with Hudson Alpha, one with Children's of Alabama, and one with UAB. So we've partnered, and we're working together to try to get whole genome sequencing to at least more people in Alabama. And we've set up telemedicine to deal with our rural neighbors. How do we get a hold of these people? How do we treat? How do we help patients do this? How do we help the physicians do this? So it's doable. You just have to choose to get involved in that. So summary then, utility, we're making a diagnosis about 25% of the time. Over time, it increases to about 39%. Why? Because there's more data available. How do we get more faster? More genome sequenced. Personalized medicine, personal utility, choices about the data. Precision medicine, I talked about that. It's how do we use this clinically. Your publications are influencing care. Whether you're looking at a gene, you're looking at a zebrafish, we're in a different world now. Think about that as you're doing what you do. Data return, what do patients want back? Who gets to decide this? Whole genome versus exome. We're finding a 25% increase, and this is going to get better with time. Utility is going to increase with time as we have better definitions around that. And I'm just going to ask, this is my favorite question. So physicians get asked this all the time. What would you do? So if it was your family member who was sick, would you do exome or would you do whole genome? And if you answer exome, I'm okay with you practicing exome medicine. But if for your family you do whole genome, then you should be doing whole genome. It's one wet lab test with a lifetime of dynamic data. Here's something that you have to think about. Today, all around the world, there's physicians making diagnoses on these people or lack of diagnosis, whether we give them the data or we don't. I'm simply going to say, if we can give them a blueprint, I think they can practice better medicine. The onus is on us, those who generate the data and those who analyze the data. So this is Jack. Jack was one of our kids. Here's Jack riding a bike, Jack after a soccer match, Jack not so sure he wants a kiss. I went to Jack's funeral a year ago. We read his genome. We didn't find out what was wrong with him. And you know why this is a problem? Because Jack has a brother. And we don't know what's wrong with him. This is not esoteric. This is people in need, and we just have to do a better job around them. So I'm going to close by a selfless promotion for a conference we're holding in Hudson Alpha. What we're going to do in this, it's a unique conference. We're going to be doing genomes for adoptees. They're going to get data back. And for rare disease, we're going to have physicians, patients, adoptees all available. It's open if other people are interested in that. There's also options for, I have to say this, people that want to sponsor. Thank you for your attention.